4 years ago, Bayern Munich pulled down Barcelona's pants in the Champions League quarter-final to the tune of an 8-2 beatdown. The manager on the Bayern bench that night, he took some journey to be there. He dabbled with becoming a banker. He was a sporting goods store owner, then a sporting director, an assistant, before finally finding his calling as a head coach. Now he manages the team he once spanked, Barcelona. This episode of European Nights is sponsored by our great friends at New Balance, a brand that I truly adore. Incredible brand behind the boot, giving players total control of the ball and the game. The Tequila touch perfected. But let's give him his full name, because he is fascinating. What a journey. Hansi Flick says he won as many trophies as he lost games at Bayern. Newspapers called this style of play Flicky Flacker. This of a man who, remember, it wasn't always sure that he'd turn into a head coach, Rory, during this frankly astounding Bayern turnaround. You were a piece for an outlet you may have heard of, the New York Times, investigating just how Flick had done it. One source told you his big secret was, quote, not being an Surely there's more to life than that. But tell us, what kind of manager is Flick besides apparently being a genuinely nice, tough but fair, gent?
I think Flick's secret is genuinely his ability to build relationships with his players. That when he was assistant to Jogi Löw at the German national team, the way, as it was explained to me, the way that the kind of dynamic worked was almost bad cop, good cop. So Löw was the sort of disciplinarian figure. He was the national team manager. He was in charge. He was the big guy. And then Flick would kind of troubleshoot, make sure the players were okay, kind of build a rapport with them, make sure they understood what Jogi was asking them to do. Obviously, in a big national team like Germany, you've got a lot of egos. Hansi Flick would be the one who'd kind of go and have a coffee with them in their room and, make sure that everything was all right, check after them, their lives at home, their wives and their children were doing okay. And I think that gave him an authority and an authenticity with the players. They wanted to play for him. He made everything kind of seem okay. And it certainly stood him in good stead when he went to Bayern. There's a lot of Bayern players in that German national team who had really good relationships with him.
You look at his astounding success at Bayern. Flick then succeeded Löw as manager of Die Mannschaft, the German national team. At one point, he described their performances as, quote, pants, as they crashed out of the 2022 World Cup at the group stages. Is a sample of a quite irate halftime team talk in Qatar.
Was ist hier? Null! Null! Wir machen sie zu einfach, den Ball zu verteidigen. Wir spielen eine Weltmeisterschaft.
Hansi Flick became the first person ever fired as manager of Germany in history. So now Flick's rolled up at Barcelona, slightly burnt at a club, also slightly burnt, but it seems his magic touch is back. His team have won 9 out of their first 10 games in the league, including a 7-0 trouncing of Real Valladolid. Rory, this is a gent who won 23 games on the bounce with Bayern. I think he won a trophy every 14 games on average, which is kind of Pep Guardiola ether, and then was self-admittedly, yes, pants with the German national team. So now, is he just good again? Explain this to me.
It's a really clear example of how dependent everything in football is on context, which sounds like a really wishy-washy, pretentious answer, but I think it's true that with Germany, you could say maybe with a national team you can't just have the good cop. That might be true. I think that's probably right. You might need an element of disciplinarian. But also you look at Germany's results over the last 4-6 years, really, and they've been intensely disappointing in major tournaments. And there is an issue with Germany, as with several other of the big sort of powerhouse European nations, that qualifying for tournaments is easy. It is no challenge. It is not a sort of assessment of their quality. Then you get to a major tournament and you have, in Germany's case, an ageing squad, an unbalanced squad, and a country that is starting to wake up to the idea that its famed youth production system has kind of faltered and been faltering for about 10 years. It's not been working as they thought it was, that perhaps the quality of player Germany was producing wasn't as high as the country had been led to believe almost. And that, in hindsight, is obviously the problem that Flick had in 2022 and that Löw had in 2018 and 2020. But what made it worse for Flick, what made it all really embarrassing, was the fact that everything was filmed. So Germany, the DFB, the German FA, had commissioned or agreed to an Amazon documentary following the team right up until the 2022 World Cup, which means there were cameras in the dressing room. And some of the scenes, I think, really embarrassed Hansi Flick. They made him look, and this isn't a technical term, but a bit weird, particularly a team talk about Geese. So in the build-up to the Japan game, which I think was Germany's first game in the tournament, Hansi Flick not only talked to his selection of international class footballers about Geese, but he showed them video of Geese. And I'm not an international class footballer, but if someone showed me videos of Geese, I'd be like, what are you doing? What have the Geese got to do with anything? And I don't know what
he showed them beautiful footage of Geese to show that on their own they are meek, but together, collectively, the way they fly, the formations they fly in, they are stronger together. And I think most of the German players just wanted to watch Geese mate or probably something like that. The ornithology did not go over well.
I get the metaphor, but the fact, and I think this is what did for Flick, the fact that a football manager would think that the players would appreciate that metaphor and not find it cringeworthy strikes me as being a really obvious misstep. Hansi Flick has been in football for long enough to know that when he thinks, should I talk to my players about Geese? The answer is always no. Just don't talk to your players about Geese. That is the best way to be a football manager.
I've got to say, that as someone that has become quite an avid birder since the pandemic, this breaks my heart that the two things that I love the most in life, football and birding, just do not go together. But he's dropped. He had to choose one, and it seems he's dropped the ornithology. And the results have changed at Barcelona, bro. I mean, even more than the results, there is one profound transition there from last year. Last season, they had one physical coach. But even before Flick's arrival, Barca had hired a team of 4, led by Antonio Conte's head physio, Julio Tos. And so far, it's not prevented the spate of horrible injuries, it's got to be said. First of all, captain and goalkeeper Marc-Andre ter Stegen out for the season after busting his knee. Same with teenage prodigy defensive midfielder Marc Bernal. Former Chelsea centre-back Andreas Christensen did in his Achilles. Linchpin defender Ronald Araujo hasn't been in since this summer, out with a hamstring. Instead of complaining about the lack of funds, Barca, remember, on a strict budget imposed by the league, which severely caps transfer spending and new wages that can be brought in, Flick's just rolled with it. In his first game, he started 3 17-year-olds. Later, in a win over Villarreal, 15 of the 22 names on the squad list had come through the Barca youth system, La Masia. It helps, it's got to be said, that Lamine Yamal has turned into the most singular exciting player in the football world on the men's side. Dude's barely out of puberty, but even still, this is a team that looks cohesive, well coached, despite serious squad holes. Rory, is what Flick's doing here somehow even more impressive given all these constraints?
Yeah, I think it is. And what's really praiseworthy is that he, as you say, he's rolled with the punches. He's done what Barcelona always should have done. And I think we've talked about this before. It's really easy to be wise outside of that highly pressurised internal environment at Barcelona. But they always have talented kids coming through. What Flick has done is given them a chance. I think there's a slight worry over how much they're playing these kids. You know, Pedri and Gavi, who are slightly older than some of the ones who've come through this season, they've both already had at least one long-term injury. They've had others that have fallen this season, and you want to make sure that they're looking after these kids, not exposing them to too much soccer too early. But Flick has had the nerve to say, if the big players that we're paying huge amounts of money to are injured, we will use La Masia as it's meant to be used. And the results have been spectacular. What Barcelona look like now is a team that is lower in quality, obviously, than the Iniesta, Xavi, Messi generation, because the players are nowhere near that level yet. But they look like a team with an identity. They look like a team with a certain degree of confidence, with a familiarity. They play smooth and slick, characteristically Barcelona football, with just a few little Teutonic tweaks. They look like a serious team again. And I think when Flick was appointed, because of what had happened with the German national team, there was a tendency to think, this is Barcelona getting a bit desperate. He's quite a big name. It doesn't really fit. It won't really work. 3-4 months in, it looks like it's worked perfectly because Hansi Flick is an extremely experienced, extremely able coach.
Remember, kids, just because you pants for a spell doesn't mean your career's destined for failure. Keep at it, and you too might host a suboptimal podcast and YouTube videos, or I guess, manage Barcelona.